I'm guessing whoever threw the book at him has been at the Ruby Buffet on a Sunday night.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, I'm Phil, and you might as well consider me a video game newbie.
Hi, I'm Kate. I've been writing software for over 10 years, but not the fun kind.
And here we are, continuing month 2 of our deep look at college football and its relationship to video games, and trying to get to that question about why it took so long for us to get a college football video game. Because as you recall, last time we went through about 20 years of college sports video game history and how they were just a regular thing you saw every year for a better part of 2 decades, up until NCAA Football 14, which was the last college sports game until EA Sports College Football 25. And we ended up last time discussing how, despite the fact that these games made a lot of money for the NCAA, for the schools, for the collegiate licensing company, for Electronic Arts, and for the other game companies that made games besides them. But there was one notable group of people who didn't, and that was the players, despite the fact that pretty much from their inception, college sports video games were trying to, as part of capturing the experience of college sports, have you play as the athletes. And we went through some examples of ones that were in NCAA Football 07, players like Tim Tebow, players like Adrian Peterson, players like Marshawn Lynch, who were basically in everything but name represented in the game, but saw no compensation for that. And what's really interesting about that when we're talking about college sports is that the relationship between college players and college video games is a microcosm of the relationship between college athletes and the collegiate sports system as a whole. And in fact, what's interesting about the Shark Tank that is college sports, for all these programs who would throw their own mothers into a volcano for the chance at a better TV deal or a 5-star prospect, the one thing they have consistently agreed upon is that players should not receive a penny of those billions in profits generated by college sports. And so today, we're going to take a closer look at that. And we're going to take a look at the relationship that college sports as a business has to the people who play it. Basically, how the sport treats the people who play it, and how the schools and the NCAA seem to view the people who play it. For a long time, the concept that college athletes did not receive any compensation was the prevailing message up until relatively recently. And in fact, that has a long history, because for defenders of the way the system ran until recently, the bedrock principle of college athletics, it's not the pageantry, it's not the personal connection to alma mater, or silly traditions like the gold cowbell, the jeweled shillelagh, or the coveted platypus trophy. Rather, instead, the true principle of college athletics is amateurism, that collegiate sports like football and basketball are extracurricular activities played by students who compete solely for the love of the game. And at the end of the day, regardless of how much money schools, coaches, or the NCAA itself brings in from broadcasting, licensing, and ticket sales, the players whom one could argue are the source of all those billions of dollars are merely students whose sole reason for attending those schools is to get a high-quality education. So what do we think about that off the bat?
Well, how much are these students really given the latitude to, take part in their education versus work full-time as an athlete?
That's a very good question. We are going to talk a bit about that. And skipping ahead, one of the challenges is how much time do they have to devote to being students versus being athletes?
I mean, it seems to me like they have to do a whole lot, and there's a whole lot of pressure for them being a bunch of amateurs.
Yeah. I can say, I went through a lot of schooling between my undergraduate and grad school. I feel like the only pressure was on me and on my parents, and it wasn't on that the entire hopes of a school were riding upon me on whether or not I got that history degree. So I can only imagine if you're like a top prospect who goes at maybe a school that people think is an up and coming, and now, okay, you have to, go to your economics classes, but also save our program. We need that Big Ten money.
It's interesting that in the Olympics, they use semi-professional, professional amateurs. There could be, say, swimmers who are in college right now, who are the best swimmers in the world. And then you have basketball where, you could be a player in the NBA who's making $60 million a year. So the fact that they're both on par with each other, competition-wise, in the same tourney as the Olympics, in my mind, that negates the ability at all for any of these people to identify as amateurs.
That's a good point. And the fact with like, especially with like the Olympics, that like you have like the USA basketball team is often like some of the highest paid prestigious athletes in basketball playing against like literal amateurs or like semi-professionals or whatever. Yeah, I think you make a good point there. And especially the amount of money that college football is bringing in, it's hard to make the argument these days that this is necessarily an amateur sport. However, the concept of the amateur college athlete playing for the pure love of the game dates to the very origins of the NCAA itself. As Palmer Pierce, the first head of the Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which was the group that predated the NCAA, explained in a speech in 1907, he said, quote, "This organization wages no war against the professional athlete, but it does object to such a one posing and playing as an amateur. It smiles on the square, manly, skillful contestant, imbued with love of the contest he wages. It frowns on the more skillful professional who, parading under college colors, is receiving pay in some form or other for his athletic prowess." End quote. And in fact, one of the few positives for the NCAA that came out of the 1984 Regents case was that the Supreme Court codified the idea that not paying players was the heart of collegiate sports. And if we recall, a couple of episodes ago, the Regents case was when the major college football programs basically took the NCAA to court over whether or not they could set up their own television deals. And the Supreme Court ruled against the NCAA and kind of created the system that we have now. In his ruling for the court, again, that same ruling that opened the floodgates for college football's unfettered quest for more TV money, Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens argued that what made the NCAA fundamentally different from pro leagues like the National Football League was that its sports were played by amateurs. Writing, quote, "The NCAA seeks to market a particular brand of football, college football. The identification of this product with an academic tradition differentiates college football from and makes it more popular than professional sports to which it might otherwise be comparable, such as, for example, minor league baseball. In order to preserve the character and quality of the product, athletes must not be paid, must be required to attend class, and the like," end quote. So this was kind of one of the things that came out of this really important case was that the basic principle of this whole operation is the fact that we don't pay the athletes. This part of the ruling became known as something called the Regents' Dicta and became the legal foundation for the NCAA's argument that athletes should not be paid because amateurism and the competition between students was a key component of the unique product the NCAA offered in college football and basketball. And that basically, in essence, supporters argued that if you started paying athletes to play college sports as we know it would cease to exist. And it would basically just be essentially a development league with fight songs.
I don't know. I have to disagree with that because that's what it is at this point. In some ways, it outperforms and out-earns pro sports.
And you could also make the argument that it's always been kind of that kind of development league. It was always kind of like a high-profile spotlight of athletes who would go on to the NFL. So you could make the argument the other way and say it was always that, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's only so many players you can poach from the Rhine Fire.
I appreciate the NFL Europe reference. Anyway, the NCAA has gone to great lengths to preserve the principle of amateurism. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, one of the factors that allowed the NCAA under executive director Walter Byers to centralize control over college sports was securing broadcasting deals. This is when Byers becomes the first executive director in the 1950s, and he becomes the first one to centralize control of those TV deals. We heard about what he did at the University of Pennsylvania, and if you need a reminder of that, check out our previous episode. And another important part of the NCAA consolidation of power and taking that power away from the university presidents was expanding its enforcement powers. And as we covered in the Panic Over College Football in 1905, the NCAA was founded as a sanctioning body governing rules of competition. And under Byers, the NCAA developed a labyrinthine system of rules for on and off the field performance, bolstered by a complex network of investigation and enforcement. And players found in violation of NCAA rules can face suspensions or full loss of their academic eligibility, while schools can face all sorts of penalties, including postseason bans, reduced scholarships, or vacated wins or championships. Supporters see the NCAA's enforcement role as an essential component for maintaining a level playing field. For example, in his memoir, Byers frequently characterizes the NCAA during his tenure as effectively doing a thankless job keeping greedy schools and coaches in line. He says numerous times, basically, like, if the NCAA was not in place, this would be chaos. You cannot trust any of these people. I will also point out that Byers left the NCAA in not the best of terms. And this book, which came out in 1995, is extremely bitter. But he's probably not wrong either. I can't see Michigan policing itself if Ohio State's going to do whatever it takes to take the best prospects.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that too. But that's pretty low stakes. There has to be some type of sanctioning body. That having been said, just because there is one doesn't mean it's not on the take.
Yeah. The fact that the NCAA takes in money from, particularly now from basketball, they're part of the system too. And there are oftentimes jokes about like, oh, well, the NCAA maybe looks the other way on some of these bigger programs, like the cynic in me. Michigan had all of these allegations of cheating in last year's national championship run. Head coach Jim Harbaugh was suspended for a couple of games for allegedly stealing signs. He's actually been suspended for a season for improper recruiting. So like if he ever comes back into the NCAA, he's going to have to sit out a year. And the cynic in me says that the reason why the NCAA didn't step in during the season is because Michigan is such a big money program that they want to see the opportunity for them to be in the national championship. And what I suspect will happen is probably in a couple of years, and again, this is just me speculating, in a couple of years, they'll probably just have them vacate their wins, which for some, vacating wins is kind of a joke because the games happened and the school saw the money from them. It just means they won't appear on their record.
So, I mean, is that it? Are there any other real drawbacks to that happening?
To vacating win?
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. If you have like a high profile head coach who was going to be like the winningest coach in college football, and he was like 12 wins away, and then those 12 wins get vacated and he's not the best anymore.
Well, then, as you said, like the games themselves were played, and like, yeah, just, I mean, it's not shocking that it seems like an empty punishment.
Yeah, if they really wanted to punish them, they would mess with the money. There's one example as a side note. Phil, did you ever follow anything about Southern Methodist, SMU?
You might have actually mentioned this. The Pony Express, there was a 30 for 30 documentary that there were players taking money, right?
Yeah, so I'll give the short version here. So in the 70s, Southern Methodist, SMU, the Mustangs, kind of broke out. They were not really a very big football program for a long time. And all of a sudden, they started getting really high profile recruits. And throughout the late 70s into the 1980s, they became a national championship contender. They were a powerhouse. They became known as the Pony Express. And they got a bunch of really, really big recruits. And people kind of wondering how they did that. Well, the reason is because they were paying them. The athletic department literally put together a slush fund, and they were paying players thousands of dollars to both come to SMU and stay at SMU. Throughout the 1980s, the NCAA kept finding recruiting violations for SMU, and they kept threatening them with stuff. They said they're going to take away scholarships, that they were going to ban them from the postseason, and it kept happening, basically. And I think it was because it's like, well, they were this big profile program. The NCAA says, no, quit it, stop doing that. And eventually in 1987, after years of warnings, they finally came down on them. They gave them something called the death penalty. And basically, what the death penalty is basically this was designed to completely dismantle this program. They significantly cut back their scholarships. They were banned from the postseason for several years. They were banned from broadcast television games. And I believe there were like huge limitations on their coaching staff. There were huge limitations on their scholarships. And basically, this completely dismantled that program. They were not relevant until a few years ago. And that's like one of the few examples of a program that actually did face significant consequences for this kind of stuff. But it also took a very long time. The reason they did this was in part because like they had tons and tons of warnings and just kept doing it, paying their players.
This feels like the playbook for certain corporations where they're like, if we run into a lawsuit, what's the most we could be fined? Will we make significantly more money than that fine? All right, well, let's just do it anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. But yeah, so all this goes back to questions about the enforcement power of the NCAA. Critics describe the NCAA's investigation arm as a Kafka-esque apparatus where suspects are guilty until proven innocent based on the flimsiest of evidence and are not entitled to administrative transparency or sufficient resources for their defense. So you can be accused and not necessarily know who your accusers are and not necessarily know all the evidence against you. And under the way that the system ran until a few years ago, there were scores of rules dictating what separates an amateur college athlete from a professional, with the distinction largely hinging on the kinds of benefits players can and cannot receive for their play. And some were pretty black and white, like SMU. That's a pretty obvious textbook case. The athletic department was literally paying players. And you hear stories about like boosters who would give gifts to high profile athletes. Wilt Chamberlain, he came away from meeting with a booster at one point and came away with a brand new car, for example. And so there are some examples of that where it's pretty obvious. I'm paying you, I'm incentivizing you. but they're also ones that are not quite so clean cut. What constitutes a monetary benefit for an athlete is extremely murky, and players have had their eligibility threatened or outright lost by a variety of different alleged infringements. And these include things like consulting with an agent about going pro, even if they ultimately decide to not go pro, using a coach's phone to call home, a college booster offering to pay for their family's airfare to attend a game, or getting a discount at a local restaurant, even if they didn't ask for one. And if you want a good example of a bunch of these, Ben Strauss and Joe Nocera, a pair of journalists, put out a book a couple years ago called Indentured. And they went through a lot of the different types of ways that the NCAA has come down on players for a variety of infringements. And for every story of Southern Methodist University paying thousands of dollars to players in a slush fund set aside by admins, or the likes of Wilt Chamberlain suddenly driving away in a new car after a visit with an alumni booster, there are numerous episodes of a player losing their ability to play ball because a coach bought them lunch because they were hungry and couldn't afford it.
That's terrible.
Yeah, it's a rough system. And there are lots of horror stories about this kind of system. And it's also worth mentioning that many big-time college athletes come from low-income communities. And as we'll learn, athletes and their families were often burdened with picking up the slack when their financially didn't go far enough, and many times it didn't. And this is on top of the fact that, they're being, coached by multimillionaires. And on top of all that, the NCAA has made it very difficult to challenge their rulings. And in fact, NCAA rules disincentivize schools from stepping up to their players' defense if they happen to be in the association's crosshairs. So, for example, in 1975, the NCAA enacted a bylaw called the restitution rule. So, for example, let's say a player loses their eligibility. It doesn't matter why, but they decide to challenge the NCAA's ruling by taking them to court. And say that court then gives a temporary injunction wherein the player can still participate in athletic activities. They can go to practices, they can go to workouts, they can play games while this is going through the courts. If the NCAA ends up winning the case, if the case is dropped, if for whatever reason it goes in the NCAA's favor, the NCAA can now turn back to that athlete and that program and punish them again, because technically that athlete was ineligible that whole time playing for them. And so then the NCAA can then come and sanction them and sanction the program. So basically, there isn't a lot of incentive for programs to go to bat for their students if they're in the NCAA's crosshairs. Because if you do stick their necks out, they could risk, losing scholarships, postseason bans, and those kinds of things could then potentially impact the money. And that ends up being the important thing, to start fucking with the money. Now, it seems that despite the extremes the NCAA will go to preserve the lofty ideals of amateurism, it is interesting that staffing unpaid non-professionals only appears to apply to the folks playing on the field and the court, and not, for example, the coaches who can set up their own sponsorship deals, host their own sports talk shows, license their images for merchandise, take in a percentage of gate sales or equipment deals, or even in some cases get the university to sell them property to buy a house, as current Rutgers head football coach Greg Schiano got from the State University of New Jersey in 2006 as a reward for managing to give the team a single winning season.
The hypocrisy of a coach yelling at players that they're not playing hard enough when the coach is making tens of millions of dollars a year and the players are completely unpaid and are just kind of struggling to get by. I hate that.
But they're doing it for the love of the game.
This might be a tangent and we can just cut it if you want to, but I'm also interested in the dichotomy of the protections or lack thereof for players versus coaches, etc. in the event of, arrests, for instance. I'm thinking of if a student gets a DWI, let's say, that could make it so that they lose their scholarship, or they're kicked off the team or something like that. Whereas, I'm guessing that there's a lot more protections in place for a professional, depending on what happens. And I'm also wondering if, in some of these situations, if a student, say, is getting in trouble with the law in a way that indicates that they might have a problem, but they're really good on the field, if it's sort of we look the other way because we want to keep you on the team, and we're not really worried about your health or safety. I don't know. I don't know if that's anything that you've even researched, but...
I know anecdotal ones. I can tell. The first thing that comes to mind is Jameis Winston, who played for Florida State.
The crab legs.
Did he steal a bunch of crab legs at a buffet or something?
Oh, I was talking about his history of sexual misconduct.
And I was kidding about the crab legs. What?
No, I was serious about the crab. That was the most famous story about him. Here, it's so weird.
Wait, he stole a bunch of crab legs at a buffet?
It's an insane story.
Okay, I'm looking this up now. This is from ESPN from 2015. This is the first line. Former Florida State quarterback Jameis Winston, who was projected to be the first overall selection in the NFL draft, said it during an appearance on ESPN's Draft Academy that he did not steal crab legs last year and that he just were given to him by a grocery store employee. He was issued a civil citation for shoplifting on April 29, 2014, after he walked out of a Tallahassee, Florida supermarket without paying for $32 worth of crab legs and crawfish. He said in a statement at the time, "I went to the supermarket with the intent to purchase dinner, but made a terrible mistake for which I'm taking full responsibility. In a moment of youthful ignorance, I walked out of the store without paying for one of my items."
It's so weird. It's like the issue here is not that he shoplifted, which is a crime. It's that he was receiving unfair compensation.
Yeah, those crab legs were unfair compensation because he would not. The argument is that he was an athlete and he got that because he was an athlete. So those crab legs would have been an unfair gift.
I'm guessing whoever threw the book at him has been at the Ruby Buffet on a Sunday night. And no.
You see, the one I thought is he also has had several accusations of sexual assault when he was at Florida State.
Oh, I didn't know about that. That's a shame.
That is less funny than the crab legs thing.
Yeah, that's not funny at all.
The other one I think of is there's a story of when Cam Newton was at Florida, a story of him being caught going out of someone's dorm room with a laptop that didn't belong to him.
Interesting.
I'm looking this up now.
Yeah, I would love to look into that. But Kate, that was a really good point you brought up, that there's a weird looking the other way on doing things that are illegal because it threatens the university's money.
Yeah, I do know at least a couple of people who went to college with some sort of sports scholarship who were okay, pretty good even enough to get a scholarship, and then one arrest of this nature, and the first thing that they lost was their scholarship and their spot on the team. Whereas I wonder if they were, for lack of a better term, better players, star players, that if wouldn't have happened that way. My guess is it would not. And then also separately just highlighting the dichotomy of however, like the different standard to which the coaches are held for their behavior than perhaps the students.
Yeah, that becomes the frustrating thing. Is like not just to be a player, but if it's a person who's considered really influential in these programs, especially if you're a coach. Again, a lot of these coaches are the highest paid state employees. You have a lot of pull and can get away with a lot of stuff. I did follow up on that thing. Again, this is from an ESPN report from November the 21st, 2008. Cam Newton was charged with stealing another student's laptop computer after being arrested. So that was a thing that happened while he was at Florida. Meanwhile, look up some of the things that coaches do. Look up Bobby Petrino. Or the most notorious example is Jerry Sandusky in Penn State.
Oh, God.
We're not going to talk about here. Look it up. On top of the idea that kind of double standard when it comes to the people who play the sports versus those who are, the coaches, and again, who are in some cases, the most highly paid employees of their states. As we learned with video games in our last episode, that players are a big part of the branding of college sports as a whole, even if the NCAA and the schools never come right out and say it. Player images and highlights appear in all sorts of marketing, including game programs and social media, and footage or rebroadcasts of games appear on sports programs like ESPN SportsCenter, dedicated networks like ESPNU, which in some cases runs rebroadcasts of the entire games. Moreover, a fan could also walk into the campus bookstore or check out authorized merch shops and buy replica jerseys of their favorite teams bearing numbers that just so happen to be the same as notable players. And while these jerseys never had player names, as with the case with the video games, it's pretty obvious who they were supposed to be. And as one notable example of this practice, on August 6, 2013, ESPN analyst Jay Billis shared a Twitter thread where he visited the official NCAA merch site, shopncaasports.com, and searched the names of prominent college basketball and football players, such as South Carolina defensive end and future ruiner of Carson Wentz, Jadeveon Clowney, Kentucky center and Philadelphia 76ers bust Nerlens Noel, and Texas A&M quarterback and future legendary train wreck Johnny Manziel. Each time Billis entered a player's last name, the site's search results helpfully brought up their corresponding school jersey and number, and Billis shared a whole thread of going through this, searching like Manziel, brought up a Texas A&M jersey with Manziel's number, Clowney, same thing, Noel, the same thing. So like they're just putting in the name as a search term, and it's bringing up the jersey. So it kind of gives the lie that they're not saying, oh, it's just happened to wear the jersey and like share your school spirit kind of thing. And the ability to straight up find Johnny Manziel jerseys for sale through the NCAA shop came as especially hypocritical, given the fact that the NCAA suspended Manziel for half a game during the Texas A&M 2013 season opener for allegedly selling a bunch of autographed memorabilia, including photos and mini football helmets. I guess his mistake was not owning a university. When asked whether selling player jerseys without those players seeing anything from those sales was exploitative, then NCAA president Mark Emmert explained to a CNBC reporter in 2011 that players don't come to college to make money. They come for the love of the game and the chance to get a high-quality education, saying, quote, "They didn't come to college because there was financial gain involved. They came because they wanted to come to school and to participate in sports. If they choose to become pros after that, that's all well and good. But it's not about creating new opportunities for them to monetize their position," end quote. As an aside, according to a June 27, 2024 report by USA Today, prior to his departure, Emmert earned an annual salary of $3.3 million, plus a $4.3 million severance package he earned when he stepped down in 2023.
Amazing.
We're going to hear more from Mark as we go. In fact, a big part of the argument against compensating college players is that they get more than enough entitlements by virtue of receiving a free ride to some of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the country and Penn State.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of debatable. Like, do most of these players finish their degrees? Do they ever leverage their degrees? It's a gray area, but the officials are certainly coming off as disingenuous.
Yeah. So what do we think about that? This idea that, like, college athletes, they get a free ride. They're getting this. Let's dissect this argument that Mark Emmert's making here, that they're getting a high quality college education, and that should be the first and foremost thing. And if we happen to take Michigan to a natty, then so be it.
Well, let me ask a quick question too, just from a purely logistical standpoint. When we're talking about free ride, are we talking about tuition exclusively, or does that typically also include other expenses like room and board, etc.?
I'm glad you asked that. Maybe we should think about then what are the costs associated with college?
Yeah, there's tuition, room and board, textbooks, if there's room for you in the dorms and you're going to live on campus. Otherwise, there can be costs associated with like renting an apartment nearby or having to travel to and from your home.
Yeah, I think of things like if you're a commuter, there's commuter costs. You got to do parking expenses. You got to buy supplies in addition to books, like things like tech. If you have like a STEM-oriented major, you're going to have to probably get like lab equipment, things like that. Yeah, anybody who has either attended college or is maybe old enough that they have kids that they need to start thinking about to pay for college knows that there's a lot of expenses associated with going to college. And so let's talk about this a little bit then. And again, this is something, that Mike Emmert, as the head of the NCAA, has emphasized throughout the course of his tenure. When people asked him about, are you concerned that the system is exploiting athletes? Like, well, they get a free education. They're getting plenty in return for this. And that's why we don't need to pay them. But again, I need to get $3.3 million a year because this place don't run itself and it don't run cheap. As he explained to reporter Lowell Bergman in an interview with PBS's Frontline in 2011, he said, quote, "These are student athletes participating in an athletic activity on their campus, and they have access to the best educational opportunities that we find in the United States," end quote. And to be fair, free college tuition is absolutely nothing to sneeze at, excluding all those other costs. I mean, for Americans saddled with a collective total of $1.77 trillion in student loan debt, it can be hard to feel sorry for people who go to school not having to deal with those kinds of costs by virtue of just the fact that they can put a ball in a hoop real good. However, it's also important to know that there's no such thing as a free education unless you live basically anywhere outside of the United States. And college players' alleged free ride comes with lots of caveats. Take, for example, something you brought up before, Kate, the workload. So how much time do you think per week a college athlete, let's say a football player, because we keep going back to football, how much time do you think per week the average NCAA football player, we'll say with one of the higher profile schools, like a Michigan, like Ohio State, like a Florida, like a Georgia, how much time per week do you think they devote just on athletics?
25 hours.
I will go 30.
You're pretty close, Kate. According to a 2019 report put out by the NCAA, FBS Division I football players, and FBS is, of course, the Football Bowl subdivision, which is the highest level of college football. Conferences like the Big Ten, the ACC, the SEC are all FBS Division I schools. According to a report by the NCAA, FBS Division I football players devote an average of 40 hours per week on athletic activities during the season, plus an additional 35 hours per week on academic obligations. So between both of them, they're devoting 75 hours a week to their schooling. For men's basketball players, it's 32 and 34 hours respectively. So it's basically like doing a full-time job on top of your existing full-time job plus like trying to find time to, eat and sleep and, play Helldivers or what all else, while essentially getting paid in nothing but exposure.
Like, can you imagine playing like some of the greatest games I've ever seen, football games, or hey, basketball games too, have been college basketball games. And you think about regional rivalries like Oklahoma versus Texas. Like, can you imagine playing in one of those games and like the nation is watching, millions of people are watching? It's a huge boost to the local economy if your team wins. And then as soon as the game's over, you have to go home and do homework.
I'd be curious. I used to teach high school youth programs, and I knew high school kids in general, and these were not athletes. Most of the people I worked with were not athletes, do not get a lot of sleep in general. I can only imagine the amount of sleep these guys are doing it on. It's like the flu game every game, It's a lot. That's got to be a lot of toll on you physically, mentally. And what's not helping, I'm glad you mentioned the regional games because, and I will say one thing is like the constant arms race for TV deals certainly hasn't made life any easier for players because, college and football and basketball keep adding new games and stretching out the season. Again, this is the first season in college football where we're having a 16-team college football playoff. So expanding an actual playoff for games. The NCAA tournament like that too. And again, I'm glad you mentioned regional rivalry games, Phil, because thanks to football realignment, athletes now also have to devote more time to travel, as where once regional conferences have become increasingly national. So, for example, Rutgers' first Big Ten conference game for the 2024-25 season was a September the 29th home game against the University of Washington. The two schools are separated by 2,800 miles. So we now have a situation where if you're a Big Ten player, you're going to have to do coast-to-coast games. If you play in Rutgers and say you could go to play like USC or UCLA or Washington and vice versa, you had now have these massive conferences, these super conferences like the Big Ten. And so like you have to devote more time to travel time, logistical time, jet lag and all that stuff. On top of the fact that you have to pull a 75-hour work week between your schooling and your athletic obligations.
Yeah, that's insane. They're full-time employees. They're not student athletes.
Yeah, and you could have kind of made an argument for this when the conferences were regional. Like the SEC used to be just the Southeast United States. The Big Ten was primarily a Midwestern conference. I mean, it's still a travel, but like a bus ride to Columbus from Ann Arbor is not as bad as, say, a plane ride from Piscataway to Los Angeles or whatever. So there's that part of it that's added to. And all of this to say that an ever-growing athletic workload leaves less time for so-called student athletes to devote to their studies. And athletes in big money sports are often pressured to take courses or enroll in majors with relatively light academic demands that will better help maintain at least the minimum GPA to remain eligible for play and not interfere too much with workouts, practice, or games. In fact, that got me thinking actually about what were the most common majors among college football and basketball players. And so I started doing a little bit of research into this. I wanted to kind of know what were the most common majors. I know the joke when I was an undergraduate was like, they're going to take like low effort majors, like no offense to them, but like, communications and economics and things like that. They're not, for example, not going to go for really STEM heavy. You're not seeing like a comp sci major who is also playing for Division I, because comp sci is a job in itself.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of, I'm sure it's not unique to me, but like we had a hard science requirement, and geology, intro to geology was one that a lot, myself included, took, and it was also derogatorily referred to as rocks for jocks because it's like that's the easy one that'll satisfy the hard science requirement for the jocks. I liked the course.
I know that's probably typical of most of the athletes. There are a couple of people in the NFL who like there was this offensive lineman for Baltimore Ravens who was like an astrophysicist or chemist or something. Like the guy was a genius. And I think there were these two brothers. I forget what their names were. Like they were defensive backs. And one of them was like a Rhodes Scholar. Like there were those types of people who are like, I don't know. They're just excellent at everything they do. And then their excellence happens in a bunch of different ways. But would not say that's the norm.
You reminded me of I was looking up who the person was. Myron Rolle, who played for Florida State, ended up getting drafted by Washington. He was a Rhodes Scholar.
That was him. And he has a brother too.
Samari? Is it Samari Rolle?
Yeah, I think so.
There is also a less talked about collegiate football award called the Campbell Trophy. The William V. Campbell Trophy is considered the academic Heisman. It's considered, according to Wikipedia, the most desirable academic award in college football. And some past winners include Oh, some interesting people who won this award. Justin Herbert from Oregon, who plays for the Los Angeles Chargers. This is going to be a deep cut for you, Phil. Remember Bobby Hoying?
Yes. Oh my God.
Bobby Hoying,
Really?
former Eagles quarterback Bobby Hoying won the Campbell Award in 1995 when he was playing for Ohio State.
Bobby Hoying was a nerd. Who knew?
Tim Tebow actually apparently won it too in 2009. Brian Leonard at Rutgers won it in 2006. This has been around since 1990. So names you may not have heard too much. Names like Danny Werfel, Peyton Manning apparently won it. Bo Nix won it in 2023.
This seems like an optics award, like the Walter Payton NFL Man of the Year award, which they call the most important award. It's the award to establish to people that everyone in the NFL is not a serial killer.
Yeah, I have not done any research into the Campbell Award. This very well could be like some astroturf thing. So see, they are student athletes. That's why we can't pay them. It's very possible it's that. But yeah, all this is to say I started looking into what are kind of the most common. Oh, so Phil just had in the chat that Samari and Myron Roll are cousins. Okay.
Sorry, like I was talking about Antrell Roll and Samari Roll. You were talking about Myron Roll?
Yeah.
Okay, Myron Roll, Antrell Roll, Samari Roll. Myron Roll is the cousin of former safety Antrell Roll, linebacker Brian Roll, and former quarterback Samari Roll. Okay, this is amazing.
There you go.
Myron Roll, FSU College of Medicine. Wow.
There you go. Myron Roll, the exception that proves the rule, I guess. So yeah, but all this got me thinking about what were the majors, and I started doing a little bit of digging. And along the way, I came across a blog post at a site called NFL Draft Diamonds, which listed a few common majors among athletes, including communication, sociology, and exercise science. However, more interesting to me is that this article also actively encouraged college athletes to pay other people to write their papers for them, framing what is by all accounts blatant cheating as a useful life hack to help players balance their athletic and academic obligations, writing, quote, "You can practice more as an athlete when you don't have to spend time in your paper or other school assignments. College athletes would benefit greatly from buying their thesis instead of writing it. It saves time and eases the burden of studying while playing," end quote. I'm sure it does.
I don't fault them for that. I don't know how they make the math work. I think they're full-time employees, and I think giving them some sort of superficial degree is, I don't know, it's not fair because they can't really use it unless you're one of the exceptional people like Myron Roll. So I don't really fault them for having, I don't know, somebody else take their classes or something.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too. I just thought there was like, I was not looking for that. I just kind of came across this article. I was looking into what were some common majors. Like, oh yeah, just have other people do the classes for you, and could just kind of framing it as a life hack. I've never seen it just so upfront and so like very nonchalant about that. Oh yeah, just have somebody else do that stuff.
In my undergrad, I was in the same class with a member of the men's Division I basketball team. And it was common knowledge that there was someone who came to the class, an employee of the university, just to make sure the player came to the class. That was his full-time job. He was one of the assistant coaches on the team. But one of his responsibilities was going to these classes to make sure the player who's in these classes comes to them. I found that baffling.
I think at a certain level, they acknowledge the kind of heavy load of that and that they want them to be focusing more time on athletics. And so you'll get things like, personal tutors, and it sounds like kind of a coach making sure they were going to classes and stuff like that. You heard about that stuff. So like there's benign stuff like that, like private tutors, but there's also super shady stuff like this site saying like people do the assignments for them or even enrolling in fake classes. And one of the most extreme example of this, on October the 16th, 2014, an independent investigation hired by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so it's UNC, one of the high-profile basketball programs where Michael Jordan went, put out a damning report documenting decades of academic fraud involving UNC's basketball and football programs. According to this report, counselors with at least the tacit approval of coaches encouraged Tar Heel players to enroll in what are known as paper classes. Paper classes are basically fake classes where the only graded thing is you have to turn in a paper at the end of the term. That's it. They're basically just a fake class to enroll in to pad their GPA so that they keep their academic eligibility. And this went on for 18 years. So it was arranged by professors in the Department of African and Afro-American Studies that were designed specifically to boost athletes' GPAs. Like I said, this went on for 18 years. It involved at least 3,100 students. And even when shenanigans are not quite so blatant, coaches and admins of high profile basketball and football programs have a lot of influence on campuses. And it's the rare uninsured adjunct making $3,000 a class who can go toe to toe with a dude who is, without hyperbole, the highest paid employee in the state over whether that starting left tackle really did get a D plus and not, for example, a B plus on the last psychology midterm.
That's amazing. And I bet all those students wrote those papers, though.
I'm sure they did. Every single last one of them.
Mm-hmm.
When I TA'd, I only encountered that I can recall one football player, and I felt bad for this kid. He clearly they'd not devoted a lot of time to teaching writing. He had to do papers, he had to do exams, and he really struggled with that. And I felt bad. He was a third string running back for this team at an FCS school. It's like, this kid's not going to go to the NFL. I hate to say it. And you worry about that because, like, there's really an incentive to have them focus on athletics and have lower effort, or no, lower effort is a mean way of saying, but take on majors and coursework that are considered less intense in terms of their workloads.
Oh, well, I do feel bad for those football players because if they're trying to get a degree and that's what their life is going to be about afterwards, football just takes up too much damn time.
Yeah. And on top of that, we'll talk about that too in a second, roughly how many athletes actually go to the pros. As we talked about before, earning a full athletic scholarship doesn't mean you're going to go for school for free. And oftentimes, an athletic scholarship, which is also known as a grant and aid scholarship, usually covers tuition and room and board. It covers basic expense. I think some of them cover books, some of them don't. Grant and aid packages can be different based on the college. But there are plenty of things that aren't covered. For example, school supplies, tech, money for meals outside of those provided by the program, and all sorts of other incidental expenses. And these can add up to put a substantial burden on players and their families to cover the rest of the costs on their own, which can be difficult in the best of circumstances. And especially so if you're coming, say, for example, from a low-income community.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but a thought also just occurred to me. These students don't have time to, not that they should if they have, you can't get a part-time job either to help offset these costs because of how much of your time is consumed with football.
Yeah, if you take on a part-time job, you can lose your eligibility. So, for example, a 2012 joint study put out by Drexel University's sports management programs and the athletes advocacy group, the National College Players Association. In this joint study, they reported that among FBS football players, the average scholarship shortfall, that is the school-related expenses not covered by a full athletic scholarship, so the things that the student had to pay for themselves, was around $3,285 per year. So it's like you get that full ride to go to, like USC or Texas, but you have to still figure out how to pay about $3,200 a year on it. And as we covered before, there are lots of ways the NCAA can take away a player's eligibility if they receive help for any of those kinds of expenses, however small, or if they try to cover those expenses with their own side hustles, even if that includes selling their own stuff. So, like, there are instances of players, for example, trying to sell their jersey, a game-worn jersey. For Terrell Pryor, who played for Ohio State and won the Heisman for Ohio State, did get in trouble with the university with a bunch of other students for attempting to sell their jerseys. I believe it was in payment for something. Like, they got something, and it's like, well, we can't pay you money because we don't have any money, and so we'll give you this game-worn jersey instead. And they got in trouble. So this happens where players are trying to pay for stuff that they can't afford through the stuff that they have. And the NCAA is saying that is you leveraging your prestige as a college player. That is you getting paid basically to play. But I hear you say all that doesn't sound so bad because, it'll be pulling down millions in the pros. And now I'm going to throw another guessing for numbers. Anyone want to guess the percentage of college athletes who end up playing professionally?
I'm sure it's a very low percentage. I'm sure I would say less than 10%.
I was going to say less than 4%.
It's lower than both of that. According to NCAA data, the odds of a college athlete playing pro ball are minuscule. 1.5% of college football players end up playing in the NFL, and 1.1% of men's basketball players go on to play in the NBA. In fact, comparing all sports, if you're looking to go pro, your best odds are baseball, because baseball players have a 5.1% chance. And even if a player beats the odds and makes it to the pros, chances are they won't be there for long. According to the NFL Players Association, the average NFL career across all positions was 3.3 years. Anybody want to guess what the highest average is and what the lowest average is for positions?
Okay, well, the highest average, it's either punter, kicker, then maybe quarterback. And the lowest, who gets beat up the most? Middle linebacker?
It's a good guess. You want to track it?
No.
So you're pretty close, Phil. On average, the highest percentage in terms of length of career are kickers. Kickers average about 4.87 years. Running backs have the shortest careers in the NFL on average, averaging 2.57 years. Statistia put it together in a nice infographic pulling from a study. League average was 3.3. It went in reverse order, so lowest to highest. Running backs at 2.57, wide receivers at 2.81, tight ends at 2.85, cornerbacks at 2.94, linebackers at 2.97, defensive linemen 3.24, offensive linemen 3.63 years, and quarterbacks were 4.44. They were second on this. Kickers and punters were the highest. Quarterbacks were next.
Wow.
And most of that was Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Throwing off the averages.
The Harvard man.
And we've got Aaron Rodgers still going at 40. And then there's Tom Brady at 43 and George Blanda at I think still sometime in his 40s. But those are the exceptions to the exceptions.
Yeah, and I remember when it was a big deal when Warren Moon played till he was 41, I think, in like the 90s. Yeah, it's a rare quarterback that's like, like a Randall Cunningham or, like Tom Brady, who's like, he breaks the scale on that. But the average ones don't play for that long. So it's like the odds of them getting that level are low. But it's also like, let's say you're a kicker and you last 4.4 years. Like, ideally, your life is going to be a lot longer than the 4 years you're playing in the NFL. So it's like, what do you do when you get out? One of the things that people would typically do is they'd fall back on their degree, but that's very difficult for an athlete considering the demands that they have. Now, if you're curious for the NBA, I did a little digging. I could not find good recent numbers. The closest I found was a NBA.com article from June the 10th, 2010 that reported that the average NBA career was about 4.5 years.
Wow.
And to make matters worse, even if players somehow manage to maintain their grades while fulfilling all their intense requirements for playing college sports, being on scholarship also doesn't guarantee a player will stay on scholarship for their entire academic career, because the way that schools do athletic scholarships is on a year-by-year basis. And renewal each year is at the discretion of the coach. And at any point, the coach could decide that they're not going to renew that contract. And it could be for a lot of different reasons. It could be, say there's a coaching change, and you want to free up that scholarship for one of your recruits. You might say, I'm not going to have you come back. You don't fit my scheme or whatever. I have this player that I have in mind. Maybe you have a history of injuries and you are more of a risk now. And I want to go with someone who's a little bit more proven or someone who's a little bit more durable. Maybe there are issues off the field. Maybe there are concerns about the academic performance. And so there are lots of reasons why an athlete might not get that. So that, full ride is not a full, say, 4-year guarantee. And at that point, there's all these lofty ideals about, they're there as student athletes. And once they lose that athletic scholarship, they're certainly free to stay so long as they can pay for it. Feel free to, pay the thousands of dollars in tuition to go to Penn State, to go to Ohio State, to go to Auburn, wherever, and again, it kind of runs in the face of those ideals about, what Mark Emmert is saying at the head of the NCAA. They're getting a great education at some of the best colleges in the world. And it's like, well, if they're off scholarship, they're free to stay at some of the best, research institutions and institutions of higher learning, so long as they can pay the thousands of dollars in tuition, like the rest of us. And so that system can seem pretty unfair, especially treating every so-called student like they're on a 1-year contract that can cost them access to that college education that guys like Mike Emmert proclaim is the whole point of college sports. However, that doesn't mean that athletes haven't pushed back. And something we're going to see through the rest of the story is parts where student athletes start stepping up and trying to push back against this system. And this is one of those examples. And so one notable player who challenged specifically the year-by-year college system was a guy named Joseph Agnew. Agnew played for Rice. He was a defensive back. And in 2006, during his sophomore year, he sustained ankle and shoulder injuries that ended up requiring surgery. And during the offseason, Rice changed coaches, and citing the new coaching team and his previous injury history, Rice revoked his scholarship the following year. Agnew appealed and secured a scholarship for his junior year, but he ended up losing his scholarship his senior year, forcing him to pay for his remaining college expenses if he wanted to stay enrolled. And in response, on October 6, 2010, Agnew filed a class action lawsuit against the NCAA, arguing that 1-year scholarships were, to quote the complaint, a, quote, blatant price-fixing agreement, end quote, between the NCAA and its schools. Part of his argument was that if he had known up front that this would be the situation, he could have shopped himself out to other schools who would have given him a better offer. And that basically them doing this system, this year by year system, is basically restricting his rights as on the free to put himself on the free market. Basically, it's basically a cartel. It's a price fixing thing, is what he effectively argued. So the NCAA filed a motion to have the case dismissed, and a U.S. judge in the Southern District of Indiana granted it on September the 1st, 2011. Speaking of injuries, even with the demise of the flying wedge, it's also worth noting that playing high-level college football and basketball exerts a lot of wear and tear on a person's body, putting athletes at risk of severe injuries and, in some cases, death. I mean, say what you will about the rigors of pursuing a PhD. I never felt my dissertation research put me at any elevated risk of bodily harm, save for those associated with excessive alcohol, caffeine, or snack consumption. College athletic programs, ever protective of their investments, will cover an athlete's medical expenses to a point as long as they're on the team. I didn't research a lot about what kind of health coverage athletes get when they're in college. I've heard some accounts from athletes that the college will cover to a certain point, but they basically expect people to have additional health insurance on top of that, so that you need to cover that too. As anyone who's taken a university health insurance plan, they suck. If you're a student, the ones if you're an employer can be pretty good. Student ones are terrible. And it sounds like, again, this is a very limited sample size from some of the accounts I've read in places like that book Indentured and a couple of other articles, that it sounds like that's no exception for student athletes either. The health coverage kind of sucks. So college athletic programs, ever protective of their investments, will cover an athlete's medical expenses to a point as long as they're on the team. However, once they're no longer with the team, either from graduation or loss of scholarship/eligibility, the former player is now on the hook to cover all of their own medical costs, which can be financially devastating if they end up requiring long-term treatment. And, they play sports that end up sometimes having long-term illnesses. As an aside, according to a February 2024 report by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, roughly 25.6 million Americans, or 7.7% of Americans, don't have health insurance, and Americans as a whole owe roughly $220 billion in medical debt. I thought that was kind of a semi-related note to this. And this then raises the question, if a player experiences a severe injury during a sport-related activity, this can include a game, a practice, a workout, while receiving an athletic scholarship to play that sport, does that constitute an on-the-job injury for which they're entitled to compensation?
My opinion is absolutely.
Because after all, if their payment for playing at a given school is an education, if we're making that argument that their payment is education in the form of financial aid, if again we take what the NCAA says as face value, their compensation is a good education, then if their payment is playing at a given school is financial aid, are they then considered employees of that school performing an assigned task for which they are paid for? And this very question has been a very frequent topic of legal debate. For example, on October the 26th, 1974, Ken Waldrop, then a running back for Texas Christian University, better known as TCU, suffered a severe spinal cord injury in a football game against Alabama that left him paralyzed from the neck down. Waldrop did eventually recover movement in his upper extremities in his arms, but he remained paralyzed for the rest of his life. TCU, exhibiting some of that good old-time Christian charity, covered Waldrop's medical expenses for a whole 9 months following his injury, then left the rest to Waldrop and his family. In 1990, Waldrop filed a claim with the Texas Workers' Compensation Commission, arguing his injury constituted an on-the-job injury, which the commission approved in 1993, essentially ruling college athletes could be considered employees of their respective schools entitled to all the workplace benefits therein. In response, the Texas Employers Insurance Association, which is the insurance company that oversaw TCU's workers' compensation insurance, appealed, and in 1997, a Travis County judge denied Waldrop's compensation on the grounds that as a TCU football player, he was not a TCU employee and therefore not entitled to compensation for his injury on the field, which the Texas 3rd District Court of Appeals affirmed in a ruling on June the 19th, 2000.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I don't think this was a great ruling. If we're to take any kind of positive note from this whole situation, following his injury, Ken Waldrop became an outspoken advocate for injured athletes and disability rights as a whole. He was part of the National Council on Disability during the Reagan and H.W. Bush administrations, and he even helped draft the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I also feel like TCU did him dirty because he suffered a debilitating, disabling injury while playing football, while playing for TCU.
Yeah, they should have to cover in my mind, they should have to cover his medical bills for the rest of his life.
TCU would disagree. In fact, dodging workers' compensation is as much a tradition in college sports as rubbing Howard's rock at Clemson, Ohio State's band dot in the eye when they spell out Ohio during halftime shows, and Alabama football fans poisoning trees at rival Auburn. That is a real story that happened.
Oh, I remember that.
So this is for context. Alabama and Auburn play a game of year called the Iron Bowl. They're both two colleges in Alabama. And one Alabama fan took it into his head there were these old trees on Auburn's campus, and he went and he poisoned them.
Oh, hilarious.
It's not a tradition. It's just this guy decided.
I mean, it can't be. There's a finite number of those.
So yeah, this kind of thing, dodging workers' comp, is much a tradition as all of those things. And getting out of paying severely injured players helped create a foundational aspect for the college sporting experience. So I'm going to take you way, way back in time here. On September the 24th, 1955, during a football game between the Fort Lewis A&M Aggies and Trinidad Junior College, Fort Lewis right guard Ray Dennison was kneed in the head during the opening kickoff, fracturing his skull and shattering part of his spine, from which he slipped into a coma and died 30 hours later. Dennison's widow, Billy, filed for death benefits for her and her 3 children under workers' compensation law, arguing that since Ray was on scholarship at Fort Lewis A&M, his death was a result of an on-the-job injury. Fort Lewis challenged the claim, and the ensuing legal battle made it all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court, who ruled in 1957 that Ray was under no contractual obligation to play football at Fort Lewis A&M because college was, in the court's ruling, quote, not in the football business, end quote. As a result, Ray's family was not entitled to death benefits because he was not an employee of the Aggie football program. Rather, he was instead a student athlete, thus giving birth to a term the NCAA, college programs, and their supporters use to justify not paying players to this day.
That's infuriating.
Walter Byers takes credit for the development of the term student athlete. So from the jump, this term was basically used as a way of justifying not compensating players.
That makes me livid, but I'll save my thoughts for our final thoughts.
So if we take the student athlete model as a face value, based on what we covered, there are a lot of reasons for college players to focus more heavily on their studies and take on majors that can give them a better chance at long-term careers beyond sports. Because even for the ones who stay healthy and make it to the highest level of play, which is the very lowest of percentages, the chances are good their time as a pro athlete is going to be a pretty brief part of their lives, and there are lots of reasons to have a backup plan in place for when your career finally ends. And getting a college degree is effectively a minimum barrier of entry for most non-athletic jobs. One would think then that free tuition at a good college should set them up for bright post-athletic futures. However, paradoxically, those same institutions of higher learning who are offering those things often disincentivize them from doing so to improve the school's chances at a lucrative bowl game or spot in the big dance so they can get a bigger cut of that sweet TV money. So it almost seems to me, this is solely my opinion, it feels like the way this model is set up seems contradictory to the ideals that they are espousing at these schools. And again, I'm going to say up front, I'm a big college football fan. I root for Rutgers. I watch the games. I'm devoting an obscene amount of hours to college football 25. So I'm part of the problem. But all this is in many respects has been the cost of it, has been that programs are more interested in them as effectively like cogs in a athletic machine as opposed to students. So even the emphasis that they are students seems kind of, the stuff that Mark Emmert seems pretty hypocritical on its face. So all of us to say, despite assertions from the likes of Mike Emmert that college players are strictly student athletes who need no pay because they're getting the chance to play a sport they love while getting a great free education, it's not so much a reality as a justification to take advantage of players and cut them loose when they're no longer profitable. Now, however, that isn't to say that college players stood around and did nothing while billions of dollars stuffed the coffers of colleges, corporations, and the NCAA at the cost of their bodies and brains. As with Joseph Agnew and Ken Waldrop, several players fought back against the amateur student-athlete system and tried to get current and former players a piece of the pie. And skipping ahead to the end of our story, they eventually won, and in so doing, changed college sports forever and led to things like College Football 25. And what's really, really fascinating about this battle is one of the most important battlegrounds in this war was video games. And that's what we're going to start taking a closer look at next time. So until then, how are we doing?
Doing okay?
I'm furious. It just makes me so angry on so many different levels. Like if they can't get paid, that's one thing. But why are they denying them resources at the university that would benefit them and would be like paltry to the university in terms of the revenue they make. Like, but you can give them a 4-year scholarship. That doesn't really cost you anything relative to the amount of money your TV rights deal is bringing in for your university. And it makes me wonder, what are colleges now? If you look at the endowments of all of these universities and the way they can generate all of this profit off of people that they legally, not only do they not have to pay them, like up until recently, legally, they were legally required to not pay them. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars there. These things seem like hedge funds at this point. I don't know why reality seems to operate differently for entities that are schools and how they can get away with all of this.
Well, and specifically how we're seeing how schools try to save money, whether when they're in trouble or when they just try to save money. Like they'll keep buying up land. You mentioned earlier about, Kevin, about securing land for housing for coaches, etc. They'll keep looking into land deals. They will keep giving the people at the top of the organizations raises and promotions while simultaneously cutting the workforce, cutting benefits. We saw that very recently at Drexel, for instance, where they reported a 500 student shortfall, I think, for enrollment. And what that looks like is people are going to lose their jobs and benefits are going to get reduced. But President Fry got a promotion and things like that. It's not an excuse, nor even really a full explanation, but it doesn't shock me to see where they are cutting costs with these athletes who are bringing in a tremendous amount of money, and not even just the direct money that they're seeing. Like they're bringing in more people who want to come to this school, whether they actually intended to try to become an athlete or not. And the one thing I'm wondering about is, it's one thing when you're a child and or a young teenager and you're trying, like, what am I going to do? I want to be a professional football player. I'm interested in the predatory practices that have to lead to bringing in enough of these students who really do think they're going to end up playing for the NFL, when you know that the reality is, even if you're fantastic at what you're doing, you're probably not going to. And even if you do get there, we're talking maybe 2 or 3 years before, your knees are destroyed. Best case scenario, and worst case scenario, you have permanent brain damage or spinal damage.
Kate, that's a sensational point. I mean, these are children. They're going to an institution of higher education. You're supposed to be educating them about what to value about themselves. Instead, you're outright exploiting them in one of the most damaging ways and irreparable ways possible.
Yeah, I should have put a disclaimer at the beginning of this. This is a rough one. There's not a lot of levity to be had. I apologize to our listeners and to you too. There's not a lot of levity to be had in this particular episode because, I think both of you make great points. It's frustrating because advocates of the system say that they're students, but they kind of don't treat them as students. It's like, yeah, you can come and be a student here, but you're here to play football. You are here to play basketball. And for a lot of people, the cost of college is so unattainably high. And even for people who are if you take out loans, those you could be paying them off for a long time. But even maybe you're not in a position where you can even take out student loans. And so athletics becomes a way to get into school. It is an opportunity. And at the same point, it's like, well, yes, you are a student, but you better not miss a workout, because you're fighting for a depth chart spot. You're trying to keep your roster spot. You got to stay healthy. You got to stay in shape. But at the same point, you got to figure out that schooling. And too bad you wanted to be a doctor, but do you want to be a doctor or do you want to play for Michigan, And they constantly have to do this balancing act of figuring out what educational opportunities are afforded to them within this system. And that was what got me looking into majors, was how many STEM majors do we see? How many engineers do we see? How many computer science people? Because those majors are extremely work intensive. And then on the other part of that too, they're not treating them like athletes either. Because an athlete, like a professional athlete, would have the opportunity, for example, to market themselves out to different schools. And schools, they court them through recruiting. But if we're all agreeing that you're only on a 1-year scholarship no matter where you go, then there's always that fear you're going to get to the end of the season, you're going to be cut loose.
Can you imagine? I mean, they know you couldn't get away with doing that to a professional athlete.
Yeah. Athletes have agents who can negotiate on their behalf, people who are trained to do this, who are trained to work with organizations to make sure that their person gets compensated the best way they can.
And who can tap you on the shoulder and say, they're screwing with you.
Yeah. Yeah, if you actively do that in college, they can take away your eligibility because you consulted with an agent, and therefore you are professional, and therefore you can't play for us anymore. Um,
Kate, it's interesting you bring that up because there is a form of that in the NFL called the franchise tag, and that is also completely unfair.
at least with a franchise tag, you're getting the highest. Was it the highest salary of the average of that position?
Top five.
You're at least getting a lot of money for that 1 year.
Yeah, it's the average of the top five players at your position for 1 year. But the reason teams do that is because that's still less money than giving them a long-term contract. So they just keep franchising them until they get an injury where it doesn't make sense to give them a long-term contract, which is,
And they kind of lose.
yeah.
And that's the thing with like college athletes is like you're always one bad injury away from your career ending at any point. Like for some of these guys, that's it. And then on top of that, after they're done, like they're dealing with those injuries for the rest of their lives. Again, it's a meat grinder in some respects. They're putting all this on the field, and for the majority of the athletes, they're not getting a whole lot out of that in terms of the sort of payout for that. They have to compromise on their majors, they have to compromise on their health, and many of them then have to figure out what they're going to do when they get out of it. Like if you've been playing basketball your whole life and you just don't get enough to the level where you're playing in the pros, well, what do I do now?
Okay, there's one basic high level point of confusion for me, which is that they're treating people this way, and there is more than enough money to go around. Like at these top programs, when you see the millions and millions of dollars that they're making, there's plenty of money here such that you shouldn't have to charge any of those students tuition.
Yeah, but if they're willing to keep doing it for very little money or for no money, like why?
And if that's part of if we've established that the rules are that we not only is like they shouldn't be paid, they cannot be paid. And if you do pay them, that they will face punishments and that the school will face punishments. Like I feel like the cynic in me says that like if Michigan could have gotten an advantage over Ohio State by paying its players, it would have done it. Honestly, skipping ahead, I think we're like right at the cusp of that, of the programs just straight up paying the players. They're doing like everything short of it right now. Again, skipping ahead, the way that name, image, and likeness is set up now in collegiate athletics, it's like they can basically be paid for anything but on the field performance. So you can take in endorsements, you can go to public appearances, you can do autograph signings, you can sell your merch. The one thing you can't be paid for is you can't be paid a contract to play basketball for like UNC. I wouldn't be shocked if eventually we get to a point the way the courts have been siding against the NCAA where we might get to that point as well.
I think what would be fair is if you're going to charge students tuition and you're not going to like pay their health care, then the people who should be policed from accepting any type of compensation are the actual universities themselves. If you signed a multi-million-dollar TV rights deal that is predicated on these people playing games on television, they are now full-time employees. So like what needs to maintain the amateur status is not the students, it's the university. The university has to create an amateur, a student athlete environment for them. So like pick one. If you want to rake in the millions and millions of dollars, so be it. Just take care of not only the athletes, but all the students.
And I just looked up out of the point you made a while back, Kate, about the endowments of these universities and how big they are. This is from a 2023 article from U.S. News and World Report, the top 15 endowments among universities. I will focus on ones that have high-profile football programs. So, like, for example, Harvard is the largest endowment in the United States. It's a $50 billion endowment. It does have a football program, but not a high. So the highest endowment for a high level, and I'm defining high level by FBS Division I program. The FBS Division I program with the highest endowment is Stanford, $36 billion. The next one after that is Texas A&M with $17 billion. Then comes Notre Dame, also with $17 billion. Then is Michigan, also $17 billion. Duke is $12 billion, well, $13 billion, $12.6 billion. And then Vanderbilt, who took down Alabama over the weekend. Some of these endowments rival the GDP of some countries. And yet there is not enough money to go around to pay the people who are generating all that money for the athletic programs.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is there is, but we're able to get them to do it on the cheap. What incentive do we have to not just keep taking the money ourselves?
It reveals that the system is unequal and it's built on this unfair system where there are people who are doing a lot of the work on this and getting nothing in return for that. And meanwhile, we have the university bringing in a lot of money from this. We have college coaches who can take in like percentages of the ticket sales. And you would argue that they're not the things that people come to see. as we saw when we talked about video games in our last episode, this idea of like using the athletes as the product has been there for the beginning. And so the question of paying athletes, there's all of these arguments that make against this student athlete system. There were lots of arguments that were made for many, many years. Walter Byers, for example, very famously, when he wrote his memoir, came out against the student athlete system. He said, this is exploitation. This is taking advantage of people. And this is the system that he helped build. And that is to say that, like, while the landscape has been changing in the last couple of years, this kind of conversation has been there from the beginning. I always think of that argument of like, this is the way we've always done it, is a poor argument because people all the time were saying that something was wrong. It's just that you didn't think that they were worth listening to. However, the thing that we'll end on here is that, as we're going to see, particularly when it came to video games and representations of athletes in video games, people started speaking out more and people started getting paid attention to. And so that's something we're going to start talking about when we get into next month's episode. We'll also, I promise, for those of you who are coming here for more video game conversation, that is going to be a lot more about video games and likeness. This was kind of the episode where we really needed to hit the hard thing. All right, well, in that case, then, that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcast and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NC SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube, and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcasts.